She trembled at the American cowboy's approach, his tall frame and wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow across the floor of the makeshift processing center. Miko clutched desperately at her thin cotton dress as the other women huddled against the wall, eyes wide with terror, whispering prayers in fragmented Japanese. For years they had been told stories about American cowboys, brutal men from Texas and Oklahoma who treated captured women worse than animals. When the tall Texan entered, spurs jingling with each step, flanked by two soldiers carrying fabric bundles, Miko's breath caught in her throat. "You will change now," he announced through a translator. The women gasped in unison, some beginning to weep silently. "We won't show our bodies," one brave soul whispered defiantly. The cowboy-turned-soldier looked confused, then horrified as understanding dawned. He immediately tipped his hat forward, turned his back, and ordered his men to do the same. "No man will look at you," he declared firmly. "These are private rooms. Only female nurses will assist." The cowboy had brought something unexpected: dignity. Miko could not remember when dignity had last belonged to her. In the decrepit comfort station near the Philippine coast, such a thing had become as foreign as the distant American homeland she had been taught to fear. The wooden building creaked in the night breeze, its walls thin enough that she could hear the waves crashing against the shore, a rhythm that had once brought her comfort, but now only measured endless time. She sat cross-legged on her threadbare mat, surrounded by 7 other women, their faces hollow in the dim light of a single oil lamp. None had spoken for nearly an hour, not since Lieutenant Tanaka had stormed through, barking that American forces were advancing quickly. "Cowboys," he had spat, with a mixture of disdain and barely concealed fear. Yua, the youngest at barely 17, had finally broken the silence. "My brother told me about cowboys before he was drafted," she whispered. "He said they chase people on horses and throw ropes around their necks." Her thin fingers unconsciously touched her throat. Setsuko, who had once been a schoolteacher in Osaka, nodded solemnly. "The officers say cowboys treat women like cattle, that they—" She paused, her voice dropping lower. "They take turns with women in front of each other, laughing. That they collect—" She could not finish. The room fell silent again, the unsaid horrors hanging heavier than the humid air. Miko closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her, but sleep was a dangerous companion these days. The nightmares had become more vivid as the war pushed closer to their isolated outpost. In her dreams, the faces of Japanese officers who had visited the station would morph into monstrous visions, men with wide-brimmed hats and eyes like burning coal, dragging women by their hair across dusty plains. She would wake gasping, the line between memory and nightmare blurred beyond recognition. Were the cowboys truly worse than what they had already endured? 3 years in this place had taught her that men's cruelty knew no nationality, but the stories told by the officers had planted seeds of terror. In the darkness of the station, with the distant sound of artillery growing closer each night, these seeds had grown into choking vines of dread. The Japanese had taken everything: her home in a small Korean village, her family, her name, replacing it with a Japanese one, and finally, her body. Yet they insisted they were protectors, that the approaching Americans would show them what true barbarity meant. Miko's thoughts scattered as a new sound cut through the night, sharper, closer than the artillery. Gunfire. The women froze, eyes meeting in the dim light. Whispers erupted. "They're here!" "The cowboys are coming." "I heard they brand women with hot irons." "My cousin said they make their prisoners walk naked through their camps." Miko's heart hammered against her ribs as the gunfire intensified, punctuated by shouts in a language she did not understand. Feet pounded on wooden steps, and Lieutenant Tanaka burst in, his uniform disheveled. "Stay inside. If they find you—" A deafening crack cut him off, and he crumpled to the floor. The women scrambled backward, pressing against the wall as the door swung open. A silhouette filled the frame, impossibly tall against the sudden flood of harsh light. The man stepped forward, and Miko saw it. The wide-brimmed hat perched atop his head, exactly as she had imagined in her nightmares. A cowboy. His voice, when he spoke, stretched his words in a strange, slow drawl that the translator behind him struggled to match. "Building secure, sir. We've found women." More men appeared behind him, and Miko could hear Yua beginning to sob. Instinctively, the women huddled closer, arms interlocking, as if their small bodies pressed together could form some kind of fortress. The cowboy stepped closer, towering over them. His eyes traveled across their faces, and Miko felt naked despite her thin dress. She waited for the rough hands, for the orders to undress, for the horror she had been promised. Instead, the cowboy removed his hat, revealing close-cropped hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. He said something to the translator, who nodded before addressing them. "You are now under American protection. You will be taken to a secure location." Protection. The word hung in the air, hollow and unbelievable. Miko had heard such promises before. The truck rumbled beneath them, its metal floor vibrating through their bones as they clutched at one another, 8 women pressed together like frightened birds. Through the canvas flap, Miko caught glimpses of a landscape transformed by war. Burned fields, abandoned vehicles, the occasional group of Filipino civilians staring as their convoy passed. No one spoke. What was there to say? They had been loaded into trucks by American soldiers, cowboys with strange accents and stranger gestures, removing hats in their presence, avoiding prolonged eye contact, keeping physical distance. It was disorienting, this performance of respect. Miko did not trust it. The truck slowed, then stopped. The canvas flap opened, and sunlight flooded in, harsh and unforgiving. The cowboy from the comfort station stood there, hat once again perched on his head. He gestured for them to descend. "Processing center," the translator said flatly. Miko's stomach clenched. Processing, a sterile word for what would surely come next, the examination, the claiming, the beginning of a new kind of hell. They were led through a gate into what appeared to be a hastily established camp, tents arranged in neat rows, soldiers moving with purpose, and a larger structure that seemed to be their destination. Fear rippled through the women as they approached. Inside, tables were arranged with papers, scales, measuring equipment. American soldiers stood at attention, and among them, Miko noticed with surprise, were women in uniform. The cowboy spoke to the translator, who turned to them. "You will be registered as prisoners of war. You will be examined for illness. You will be given new clothes." Setsuko's hand found Miko's, squeezing until it hurt. This was it. The moment the horror would begin anew. The cowboy continued speaking, and the translator's words came slowly. "First, you will change from these clothes. They are—" He hesitated, searching for the right word, "unclean." The women exchanged glances, understanding immediately what was being asked. They had done this hundreds of times before for Japanese officers. The familiar shame rose in Miko's throat like bile. Then the cowboy did something inexplicable. He walked to the corner of the room where several folded screens leaned against the wall, the kind used in private homes to partition rooms. With the help of another soldier, he began setting them up, creating a small enclosed area. Next came a table with folded clothes, towels, soap. The women watched in confused silence. What ritual was this? The female soldiers approached, carrying additional items: combs, toothbrushes, small mirrors. The translator spoke again. "You will go behind screens. You will change. No men will see." For a moment, no one moved. The words made no sense, like a language heard underwater. Privacy? Modesty? These concepts had been stripped from them so long ago they had forgotten their shape. Yua was the first to understand, her young face registering disbelief. "They're going to let us change clothes? Alone?" she whispered. The translator must have heard, because he nodded. "American soldiers do not look at prisoners without clothes. It is forbidden." The cowboy, as if to demonstrate, turned his back completely. The other male soldiers followed suit, facing the wall. One by one, the women were led behind the screens by the female personnel. When Miko's turn came, she entered the small space with her heart pounding. She waited for the trick to be revealed, for the screens to be yanked away, for leering faces to appear above. But there was only a kind-faced nurse who pointed to the clean clothes, then stepped outside the screened area, standing guard to ensure no one entered. Alone for the first time in years, Miko's fingers trembled as she removed her filthy dress. The privacy was so absolute it felt wrong, like a luxury she had no right to claim. The clean cotton of the new clothes against her skin was a shock, the sensation almost painful in its gentleness. When she emerged, she saw the other women in various states of transformation: clean clothes, wet faces from washing, expressions stunned. Something had cracked open inside Miko, a small fissure in the fortress of fear she had built. The cowboy, still facing away until all were dressed, had given them something they had forgotten existed. Not just clean clothes or soap, but the radical notion that their bodies belonged to them, that they deserved to be unseen. It was too enormous to comprehend, too dangerous to believe. Yet as they were led to another building for medical examinations, Miko found herself walking differently, her spine slightly straighter, her gaze no longer fixed permanently on the ground. The shame was still there, a constant companion after so many years. But beside it now grew something fragile and unfamiliar. A question. What if everything they had been told about American cowboys was wrong? The medical tent smelled of antiseptic and clean cotton, so different from the cloying scent of sweat and disease that had permeated the comfort station. Miko sat on the edge of an examination table, a thin paper sheet pulled across her lap. Her hands trembled. Medical inspections under Japanese control had been perfunctory, humiliating affairs, checking only that they were not too ill to serve their purpose. When diseases appeared, as they inevitably did, the women were given just enough treatment to continue functioning. Their pain was irrelevant. The American doctor who entered was not what Miko expected. She was a woman, older, with gray-streaked hair pulled back severely from her face. Her eyes, though, held none of the contempt Miko had grown accustomed to seeing. "I'm Dr. Reynolds," she said, the translator conveying her words. "I'm going to examine you for illness and injury. I'll explain everything before I do it." What followed was unlike any medical experience Miko had known. The doctor asked permission before touching her. She spoke directly to Miko rather than about her to assistants. When she discovered the badly healed burn on Miko's shoulder, punishment from a Japanese officer for spilling tea, the doctor's face tightened with anger. But the anger, Miko realized with astonishment, was not directed at her. "This wasn't treated properly," the doctor said, her fingers gentle around the scarred tissue. "We can help it heal better." Down the row of examination tables, Miko could hear Yua weeping softly as a nurse treated the chronic infection that had plagued her for months. Setsuko was being given pills for the persistent cough that had been ignored by their captors. For these cowboys and their medical staff, their suffering mattered. Their bodies were not commodities to be maintained just well enough for use, but human vessels deserving of care. The translator moved between tables, explaining diagnoses, treatments, asking questions the women had never been asked before. Where does it hurt? How long have you felt this way? The most shocking moment came when Dr. Reynolds discovered evidence of the repeated sexual trauma they had endured. There was no disgust in her expression, no judgment, only a deep, professional compassion that somehow hurt more than cruelty would have. "These injuries will heal," she told Miko, meeting her eyes directly. "Your body can recover." The simple acknowledgement of what had happened to them, not as an expected duty but as a wrong inflicted, left Miko speechless. When they left the medical tent, each woman carried small bottles of medicine, bandages, ointments, tangible proof that their pain had been seen and addressed. More profound than these physical remedies was the experience of being treated as patients rather than objects, of having strangers, enemy strangers, respond to their suffering with care rather than indifference or exploitation. That night in the women's barracks, as they compared their treatments in whispered conversations, something shifted in their collective understanding. "They treated my body as if it belonged to me," Setsuko said quietly, "as if it mattered what happened to it." The words hung in the darkness. Simple, yet revolutionary. Miko touched the clean bandage on her shoulder, feeling the strange new weight of being valued. Words flowed around the women like a river, most washing past without meaning. English hung in the air, harsh, flat sounds that bore no resemblance to the Japanese they had been forced to learn, or the Korean and Filipino languages many of them had grown up speaking. The camp translator, a slim Filipino man named Mateo, moved between worlds with careful precision, but the women regarded him with caution. Translators in the comfort stations had often twisted words to entrap them, reporting fabricated insubordination that led to punishment. "The cowboy officers say you are protected by Geneva Convention," Mateo explained during their first formal briefing. The women exchanged glances, unfamiliar with the term. "It means there are rules about how prisoners must be treated, rules that protect you." Setsuko raised her hand tentatively. "Rules against what?" she asked. Mateo's eyes flickered briefly before he answered. "Rules against violence, against unwanted attentions from soldiers, against hunger or poor conditions." His careful phrasing hung in the air. Unwanted attentions, such a delicate way to name what had defined their existence for years. The women listened with blank faces, trained to hide reactions. Words were cheap. They had heard promises before. Yet, as days passed, the translator's explanations were matched by actions that required no interpretation. The way the cowboy guards kept their eyes level, never lingering on women's bodies. The full portions of food served without expectation. The careful distance maintained by male personnel who stepped aside when women passed, rather than forcing them to yield. One afternoon, a young American guard accidentally entered the women's washing area. Upon seeing Yua at a basin, he immediately backed out, face flushed with embarrassment, calling out apologies. The incident spread through the group like wildfire, not because it was remarkable that a man had seen a woman washing, but because his reaction had been shame rather than entitlement. "He acted as if he had done something wrong," Yua whispered, wonder in her voice. Another day, a new directive was translated. The women were to be issued whistles to carry at all times. "If any soldier approaches you in an improper way, you blow this," Matteo explained, demonstrating. "Guards will come immediately." The women accepted the whistles with confusion. A tool to summon help against their captors, given by their captors? It made no sense. Yet the whistles represented something profound, an acknowledgment that their boundaries mattered, that their consent mattered. No such concept had existed in the comfort stations. Beyond words and rules came the most powerful communication: consistency. Day after day, the boundaries remained firm. No midnight visitors to their barracks, no special duties assigned to prettier women, no gradual erosion of the initial respect. The cowboys, with their strange hats and accents, maintained the same careful distance in the second week as they had on the first day. Slowly, the rigid posture of the women began to soften. They stopped flinching when a door opened unexpectedly. They began to look at the translator when he spoke, rather than at the ground. What convinced them was not what the Americans said, but what they didn't do. The absence of horror spoke a language far clearer than any translation could provide. This clarity brought with it a different kind of pain. 1 month into their captivity, Miko sat on her bunk, watching rain streak down the barracks' windows. The wooden building was sturdy, protecting them from the downpour that turned the campgrounds to mud. A luxury, to be dry, to be warm, to sit idle without punishment. The women had been issued 2 blankets each, had access to hot water for washing, received 3 meals daily. The food itself was strange, bread instead of rice, unfamiliar meats and vegetables, but it was plentiful, served without reservation or condition. Miko's face had filled out, the hollow cheeks softening. Her monthly bleeding had returned after years of irregularity. Her body was healing, responding to regular meals and rest, like a plant finally given water and sunlight. This physical revival brought with it a creeping shame. How could she accept this care from the enemy? How could her body betray her by thriving in American captivity? The Japanese officers had called themselves protectors while subjecting them to systematic abuse. The American cowboys had been portrayed as monsters, yet they maintained a respectful distance, enforced rules that shielded rather than exposed the women. The contradiction was unbearable. "I dreamed of home last night," Setsuko said softly from the next bunk. "My mother was serving tea in our garden. When I woke up, for a moment I thought I was there." She paused, looking down at her hands. "Then I realized I was here and I felt—" She struggled to find the word. "Safe. I felt safe in an enemy camp. What kind of traitor does that make me?" The question hung in the air, giving voice to the conflict that churned inside all of them. Across the barracks, reactions to their improved circumstances varied dramatically. Hana, an older woman who had been in comfort stations the longest, refused to accept any change of narrative. "They're still the enemy," she would whisper each night. "This kindness is a trap. It will close around us when we least expect it." She hoarded food beneath her mattress, kept her few possessions bundled and ready for flight, flinched when American personnel came near. Her suspicion was a shield against hope, which had betrayed her too many times before. Others moved in the opposite direction, adapting with startling speed. Yua had begun learning English phrases from a sympathetic nurse, practicing them quietly. "Good morning, thank you. May I have more?" "Please." The words fell from her lips with increasing confidence. She smiled at the guards, waved at the doctor when she visited. This eager adjustment unsettled the others, as though Yua were rushing toward forgiveness that none of them had earned the right to offer. Most, like Miko, occupied the painful middle ground, unable to maintain hatred for captors who treated them with basic humanity, yet unable to release the years of conditioning that named Americans as enemies. They accepted the food, the medicine, the clean quarters, but kept their gratitude hidden, a secret shame. The greatest betrayal came in moments of comparison. When Miko overheard American guards discussing the war, their casual mentions of Japanese military conduct forced confrontations with truth. The comfort stations had not been a tragic necessity of war, as they had been told. They had been a crime, recognized as such by international law. The women had not been serving their empire honorably. They had been victims of their own countrymen's violations. "We were sacrificed," Miko whispered one night as they prepared for sleep. "Our own people sacrificed us, then told us it was glory." The words tasted like poison on her tongue. To have been abused was one wound. To have been lied to about the nature of that abuse was another entirely. The rain continued to fall, drumming against the roof like distant artillery. Miko pulled her blankets tighter, wrestling with the contradictions. She was a prisoner, yet freer than she had been in years. She was in enemy hands, yet safer than she had been among her own forces. She was healing, yet the recovery itself was a kind of betrayal. The Americans had not simply captured her body. With their unexpected dignity, they had captured something more dangerous, her understanding of the war itself. And that shift, that terrible clarity about who had truly harmed her, was a prison without walls, one she might never escape. Screams shattered the night's silence, startling women awake across the barracks. It was WWII again, her small body rigid on her bunk, eyes open but unseeing, locked in some private horror that sleep had unleashed. This was the third time this week. Miko reached her first, carefully avoiding touching the girl until her thrashing subsided and awareness returned to her gaze. "The lieutenant was here," WWII whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He was standing right there." She pointed to the empty space beside her bed, her finger trembling. But there was no lieutenant, only shadows and the concerned faces of women who understood exactly what phantoms haunted her dreams. The nightmares had begun gradually, as their bodies strengthened with proper food and rest. As the immediate fear of mistreatment faded, something unexpected happened. The terror they had suppressed for years began to surface, no longer held at bay by the constant vigilance survival had demanded. They were safer now, and paradoxically, this safety allowed the full weight of their trauma to emerge. Setsuko developed a habit of washing her hands until they cracked and bled. Hana refused to speak for days after a tall cowboy guard accidentally startled her. Others reported chest pains, sudden sweats, moments when they couldn't catch their breath. Physical safety had created space for wounds of the mind to make themselves known. The Americans noticed. 2 days after WWII's most violent nightmare, Dr. Reynolds arrived at the women's barracks accompanied by 3 additional female personnel. "These are specialists in healing the mind," the translator explained as the women gathered. "They understand what happens after difficult experiences." The concept was foreign. In their previous captivity, mental suffering was irrelevant. Only physical functionality mattered. Yet here were medical professionals concerned not just with their bodies but with their nightmares, their fears, their fractured sense of self. Captain Davis, the Texan cowboy who had first discovered them, made an announcement through the translator. "No male personnel will enter the women's area without female escort. All medical examinations will be conducted by female doctors only. Guards assigned to this section will maintain twice the standard distance." The strictness of these new protocols surprised even the women. Some wondered if this separation meant the Americans now viewed them with disgust, knowing what had happened to them. The translator clarified, "The captain says this is for your comfort and healing, not because you are unclean, but because you deserve peace." Peace. Another foreign concept. A female nurse named Sarah began visiting daily, sitting with small groups of women. She spoke softly, the translator conveying her words with careful precision. She did not demand they speak of their experiences, but offered space for words if they wished to share them. Most didn't, not at first. The silence itself was healing, sitting without demands, without performance, without use. Slowly, fragments emerged. Yua spoke of her village, of being taken when she was 15. Setsuko described her teaching position, cut short by conscription. Each personal history shared was a reclamation, a thread of identity rewoven. The nurse listened without judgment, asked gentle questions, taught them simple exercises for when panic rose in their throats. "When the memories come," she instructed, "feel your feet on the ground. Name 5 things you can see right now. Breathe slowly." Such simple tools, yet they became anchors in storms of remembering. The healing was neither linear nor complete. Hana still refused to speak to the specialists. Miko participated but felt hollow afterward, uncertain if words could ever rebuild what had been shattered. Yua's nightmares continued, though less frequently, but something was shifting, molecule by molecule. The women began to speak more among themselves, sharing not just memories of home, but of the violations they had endured. In their shared experience lay a terrible unity, a knowledge that none of them carried their shame alone. One evening, Captain Davis visited the perimeter of their barracks area, maintaining his distance as promised. He spoke briefly with the translator, who then approached the women. "The captain asks if there is anything else that would help you feel safer here." The question hung in the air, stunning in its simplicity. For years their safety had mattered to no one, least of all those with power over them. Yet here was this tall Texan in his cowboy hat, asking what more he could do. The unexpected dignity of being asked, of having their needs considered, was perhaps the most powerful medicine of all. That night, Miko slept without dreaming for the first time in years. The morning brought a new development. A stack of paper, envelopes, and pencils appeared on the mess hall table. The translator stood beside Captain Davis, whose hat was held respectfully against his chest as he addressed the gathered women. "The captain says you may write letters home," Matteo explained. "The Red Cross will attempt to deliver them when safe passage is possible." For a moment the room was perfectly still, the women frozen between disbelief and sudden, overwhelming emotion. Communication with the outside world had been severed so completely, for so long, that many had stopped imagining their families as still existing in the same universe they inhabited. The prospect of bridging that void with mere paper and pencil seemed simultaneously miraculous and terrifying. They approached the table cautiously, each taking a sheet as if it might disintegrate in their hands. Miko traced her finger along the blank page, mind racing. Her village in Korea had been under Japanese occupation for years before she was taken. Did her family still live? Would a letter even reach them? And if it did, what could she possibly say? Back in the barracks, the women sat on their bunks, pencils hovering over paper. The blankness before them was daunting in its possibility. Some began immediately, characters flowing onto the page in rushed, desperate strokes. Others stared for hours, paralyzed by the weight of all that had happened since they had last spoken with loved ones. "I don't know how to begin," Setsuko confessed, her pencil still untouched. "Do I write, 'Dear Mother, I have been in a comfort station, and now I am a prisoner of American cowboys? How do I explain what cannot be explained?" Her question hung in the air, giving voice to the impossible task before them all. Miko looked down at her own blank page. The truth was unspeakable, yet lies felt like a betrayal of her own suffering. She finally began with the simplest fact: "I am alive." The words stared back at her, both inadequate and profound. Around her, each woman wrestled with similar decisions. Some chose careful omissions, writing only of their current safety, their adequate food and shelter, the medical care they received. Others hinted at hardship without naming it directly. A few, like Hannah, wrote with bitter honesty, their characters slashing across the page like accusations. "Will you tell them about the Americans?" Yua asked quietly, her own letter half finished. "Will you tell them they are not as we were told?" It was another impossible question. To acknowledge the humanity of their captors felt like undermining years of national loyalty, yet to perpetuate the lies that had enabled their own abuse seemed equally treacherous. While the women composed their complex truths and half-truths, another documentation process was unfolding. In an office at the camp's administrative center, military personnel conducted formal interviews with each woman who was willing to speak. These were not friendly conversations like those with the nurse Sarah. They were official depositions, with court stenographers recording every word, photographs of injuries taken as evidence, dates and locations noted with military precision. Captain Davis explained through the translator, "These are war crimes. Your testimonies will be part of the official record." The concept stunned them. War crimes. The phrase reframed everything that had happened to them, not as an unfortunate consequence of conflict, not as a patriotic sacrifice, but as a punishable offense against humanity itself. For some, this official acknowledgement was validating. Others recoiled from the publicity, the idea that their shame would be preserved in military archives. When it was Miko's turn to give testimony, she sat stiffly in a wooden chair, facing a female officer with kind eyes but formal demeanor. "Please state when and where you were first taken," the officer requested through the translator. Miko closed her eyes briefly, then began speaking. As the words left her mouth, she realized she was doing more than providing evidence. She was reclaiming her own history, pulling it from the shadows of shameful secrecy into the light of historical record. 3 weeks after the letters were collected, the impossible happened. Replies began to arrive, thin envelopes carried carefully by Red Cross workers. Not for everyone. Many families could not be located, had been displaced by war, or lived in areas still too dangerous to reach. But for a few women, including Yua, whose family had survived in a small village largely untouched by fighting, connection was restored. Watching Yua's face as she read words from her mother for the first time in 3 years, Miko felt a complex emotion rise within her, part joy, part envy, part hope that perhaps somewhere, someone, still remembered her name and waited for her return. News traveled through the prisoner of war network like water through soil, slow but inexorable. First came whispers among the military translators who moved between compounds. Then rumors passed through the Japanese male prisoners during work details, spreading between camps via transfer convoys. The story of the comfort women and their treatment by American forces, particularly the Cowboys from Texas and Oklahoma with their distinctive hats and accents, became something of a legend. The tale grew in the telling, how the Cowboys had turned their backs rather than watch women change clothes, how they had established separate facilities with female guards, how they provided medical care without exploitation. For Japanese soldiers raised on propaganda about American barbarity, these accounts created cognitive dissonance. "Is it true," a newly captured Japanese officer asked a longtime prisoner, "that the Americans treat the comfort women with respect?" The question carried layers of meaning. If Americans treated even these women, considered the lowest class of prisoner, with dignity, what did that say about everything they had been taught? The ripple effects reached beyond prisoner gossip. At a command meeting, Captain Davis and other officers presented a report about their protocols for female prisoners. "The measures implemented at Camp Harmony have shown significant success," a female officer explained to assembled leadership. "Not only in humanitarian terms, but in intelligence gathering. Women who feel safe are more willing to provide information." Policies were formalized, documented, and disseminated to other POW facilities. The privacy screens, female medical personnel, and increased distance requirements became standard procedure rather than improvised accommodations. Captain Davis found himself assigned to train other units in these approaches, his cowboy hat becoming something of a symbol for this new philosophy of prisoner treatment. Within the women's compound, the atmosphere subtly shifted as winter gave way to spring. Conversations no longer revolved exclusively around immediate needs and daily routines. Increasingly, the women spoke of after the war, after release, after return. These discussions were fraught with uncertainty. "What will happen to women like us?" Setsuko asked one evening as they sat mending clothes. "Who will marry us after what we have endured? What family will welcome us home without shame?" These questions had no easy answers. Their bodies had healed, but their social position had been irrevocably altered. In many of their communities, their value as women had been tied to purity, a concept that had been violently taken from them. "Perhaps we don't go home," Yua suggested, her English improving weekly under the tutelage of her American nurse. "Perhaps we go somewhere new. America, maybe." The idea hung in the air, simultaneously preposterous and seductive. To start again in a place where no one knew their history, where cowboys turned their backs to preserve women's dignity, it was a fantasy that offered escape from the judgment that surely awaited them. Miko kept her own counsel, uncertain what future she could imagine for herself. The war continued beyond the wire fences, though news arrived that Japanese forces were retreating across the Pacific. Each territorial loss brought the end closer, but also more questions about what that end would mean for women with no clear place in the post-war world. Some nights she walked to the edge of the permitted area, looking past the fence to the hills beyond. Freedom waited there, yet freedom to what? To return to Korea, now damaged by years of occupation? To face family who might reject her for what had been done to her? To build a life from the broken pieces of her former self? The questions had no answers, only more questions nested within them like Russian dolls. Yet asking them felt like a luxury after years when tomorrow held only the certainty of continued abuse. To contemplate a future at all was a kind of victory, one made possible by the unexpected dignity offered by men they had been taught to fear. The cowboys, with their strange hats and stranger principles, had not only protected their bodies, but had inadvertently restored something they had thought permanently lost: the ability to imagine a life beyond survival. "What will you do?" Setsuko asked her one evening. "When we are free?" Miko looked down at her hands, stronger now than they had been in years. "I don't know yet," she answered honestly, "but I will choose it myself." That is enough for now. If you like this story, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. The news arrived with the dawn, carried by a breathless translator who burst into the women's barracks without ceremony. "Japan has surrendered," he announced, the words hanging in the air like smoke. "The Emperor has spoken on the radio. The war is over. For a moment there was only silence. No cheers, no tears, just 8 women sitting perfectly still, absorbing the seismic shift those simple words represented. The end they had both longed for and dreaded had arrived. Yua was the first to speak, her voice barely audible. "Are we free now?" The question contained multitudes. Free from captivity, yes, but free to what? Free to return to homes that might no longer exist? Free to carry the weight of their experiences back to communities that would not understand? The camp transformed in the days that followed. Lists were compiled, transport arrangements discussed. Captain Davis visited with the translator, his cowboy hat in his hands, to explain the process. "You have choices," he said, the words carefully relayed. "Repatriation to your home countries, temporary residence in American territories, in some cases, application for immigration to the United States." Choice, that precious commodity they had been denied for years, now presented itself in overwhelming abundance. The women gathered in tight circles, weighing options, measuring fears against hopes. "My family wrote that our village was mostly spared," Yua said. "My mother wants me home." Her face showed both longing and terror. To be embraced by family again, what greater blessing! Yet her letters home had been carefully crafted, revealing nothing of the comfort station, nothing of the years of abuse. Would that silence be sustainable once she returned? Would her mother see the truth in her eyes, in her flinches, in her nightmares? Setsuko made a different calculation. "There is nothing for me in Japan," she said flatly. "My parents died in the Tokyo bombings. My reputation is destroyed. I will apply to stay in America." Her decision shocked the others, particularly Hana, who still maintained that Americans were the enemy, despite all evidence to the contrary. "How can you choose to live among them?" she demanded. Setsuko's reply was simple. "Because here no one knows what I was. Here I can be only who I am now." The word "was" hung between them. They had been daughters, students, workers, women with ordinary lives. Then they had been comfort women, a term that disguised systematic rape as some form of patriotic service. What would they be next? Who would they be allowed to become? For Miko, the choice was complicated by uncertainty. Her letters to Korea had gone unanswered. She had no confirmation of family alive or dead, home standing or destroyed. To return was to journey into an unknown that might offer either healing or deeper wounds. "I don't know what to do," she confessed to Captain Davis through the translator, during her repatriation interview. The cowboy's face softened beneath the brim of his hat. "You don't have to decide today," he said. "Interim arrangements can be made." His kindness, consistent to the end, made her throat tighten with emotion she could not name. As the day of first departures approached, the women's barracks became a place of quiet preparation and harder conversations. "Will you tell them?" Yua asked Miko late one night. Her voice barely a whisper. "If you go back, will you tell your family what happened to us?" The question cut to the heart of their shared dilemma. Truth meant possible rejection. Silence meant carrying the burden alone. Neither option offered peace. "I don't know," Miko answered honestly. "I think perhaps some truths can only be told in pieces, over time, when trust is certain." Yua nodded, understanding. They were discussing more than disclosure. They were discussing how to rebuild lives from fragments, how to carry unspeakable pasts into uncertain futures. The morning Yua left, bound for her village with a group of other repatriating prisoners, the women gathered to say goodbye. There were no tears. They had learned long ago to hold emotion carefully, but their embraces spoke volumes. They had entered captivity as strangers, united only by shared degradation. They departed as something closer than friends, but harder to name, bound by an understanding no one else could fully comprehend. Watching the truck disappear down the camp road, Miko felt both loss and a strange sense of possibility. The war had ended. For better or worse, the time of waiting was over. The struggle to reclaim their lives, to determine what those lives could now be, was only beginning. Silence became their companion, more faithful than any friend, more constant than any lover. In the decades that followed the war, women like Miko moved through the world carrying stories locked behind their teeth. Some returned to Korea, to China, to the Philippines, slipping into villages and cities as quietly as shadows. Others remained in America or its territories, building new lives in places where their histories were unknown. Whether they returned home or started anew, most shared the same strategy: silence, absolute and unyielding. Miko herself returned to Korea, finding distant cousins in a town far from her birthplace. She married a quiet man who asked few questions about her years away. She bore 2 children, tended a small garden, attended church, and never spoke of what had happened in the comfort station or the American camp. When nightmares came, as they still did, she suffered them alone. On the rare occasions when war was discussed, she offered only the sparest details. Yes, she had been taken by Japanese forces. Yes, she had been a prisoner of Americans afterward. Nothing more. Her silence was a fortress, protection not only for herself, but for those she loved. Why burden them with horrors they could neither understand nor undo? This wall of silence was not unique to Miko. Across Asia, thousands of former comfort women made the same calculation, burying their experiences beneath layers of ordinary life. Some, like Yua, found families who sensed the unspoken and respected its boundaries. Others lived with the constant fear of discovery, of whispers that might follow if the truth emerged. In rare cases, women found each other, recognizing in another's eyes the same haunted knowledge, the same careful management of memory. These connections, when they occurred, offered unique solace. With each other, no explanations were needed. A look, a nod conveyed understanding beyond words. The world around them moved on. Japan rebuilt. Korea struggled through division and war. America's global influence expanded. History books recorded battles, treaties, political realignments. The comfort women existed in footnotes, if mentioned at all. Their suffering remained in the shadows, convenient to forget in the new geopolitical order where former enemies became strategic allies. But silence, however carefully maintained, cannot last forever. In the 1980s, nearly 40 years after the war's end, the first public testimonies emerged. A Korean woman named Kim Hak-sun stood before microphones and cameras, her face lined with age, but her voice steady, and told the world what had been done to her and thousands of others. Her courage cracked open the door, and slowly, painfully, others followed. Miko watched the news reports with her hand pressed against her mouth, tears flowing unchecked down her face. She was an old woman now, her husband long dead, her children grown with families of their own. She had never told them. Now history was speaking what she could not. The movement for recognition gained momentum. Former comfort women from multiple countries came forward, demanding acknowledgement, apology, and compensation from Japan. Documents were unearthed, testimonies recorded, memorials erected. For some survivors, this public reckoning brought a measure of peace. For others, including Miko, it came too late. Too many had already died, carrying their secrets to the grave. Yet, in the midst of this belated, justice-seeking, unexpected connections formed. At a survivors' gathering in Seoul, Miko found herself seated beside an elderly woman whose face tickled some distant memory. It was Setsuko, now an American citizen who had returned to participate in the testimonial project. Their recognition was instantaneous and overwhelming. As they embraced, trembling with emotion, Setsuko whispered, "Do you remember the Cowboys, how they turned their backs?" That simple memory, men choosing not to look, choosing to preserve dignity rather than exploit vulnerability, had remained with them both for half a century. It had been the first moment of reclaiming humanity after years of dehumanization. Their conversation lasted hours, stretching into the night. They spoke of the others. Yua had lived a full life before passing away 5 years earlier. Hana had never been heard from after repatriation. They spoke of nightmares that still came, less frequently, but no less vivid. And they spoke of healing, the slow, uneven process of rebuilding a self after systematic destruction. "The Americans didn't heal us," Setsuko said thoughtfully. "No one could do that but ourselves, but they showed us something when we needed it most, that we were still human, still worthy of respect." It was perhaps the most powerful legacy of those strange days in captivity, the reminder of their own humanity, offered by the most unlikely of sources, cowboys in a prisoner of war camp who chose to turn their backs rather than watch women change their clothes. A small act that helped reclaim what systematic abuse had tried to destroy: dignity, autonomy, and the fundamental right to privacy. These echoes continue to resonate, even as the last survivors reach the end of their lives, even as history struggles to fully acknowledge their experiences. In their stories lies a powerful truth about both the depths of human cruelty and the unexpected sources of compassion that can begin the long journey back from trauma's edge. If you liked this story, like and subscribe and let us know where you are watching from.